Harlem, New York. At exactly 6 a.m. on Thursday morning, November 28th, while the rest of New York City slept off their Thanksgiving preparations, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked out of a black Cadillac in front of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, wearing a camel hair overcoat that cost more than most Harlem families earn in 6 months, a fedora tilted just slightly to the left, and carrying a Cuban cigar that he lit slowly while surveying the line of people that stretched 6 city blocks down 125th Street and around the corner onto Lenox Avenue. These weren't customers coming to place policy bets or debtors coming to pay what they owed. These were mothers with children bundled against the November cold, elderly men and women who'd been waiting since 4 a.m. in temperatures that hovered just above freezing, working families whose paychecks never quite stretched far enough to cover both rent and food, all of them waiting for the moment when Harlem's most feared gangster would personally hand them a 20-pound frozen turkey, canned goods, fresh vegetables, pies, and in many cases envelopes containing cash that would keep their electricity on or prevent their eviction or buy medicine their children desperately needed. Johnson took a long drag from his cigar, exhaled smoke into the cold morning air, and nodded to his men. The distribution began, and for the next 14 hours, the 58-year-old criminal who has been arrested 47 times, who runs an $8 million gambling empire, who controls narcotics distribution throughout Harlem, who has killed men with his own hands and ordered the deaths of dozens more, stood in the freezing cold, personally greeting every family that came through the line, shaking hands with men who gambled away their paychecks in his policy banks, hugging women whose sons he employed as runners and collectors, kissing children who would grow up to either work for him or fight against him, treating each recipient not as a charity case, but as a neighbor, as family, as someone entitled to dignity and a real Thanksgiving dinner, even if they couldn't afford to buy one themselves. By the time the last turkey was distributed at 8 p.m., Johnson had given away 3,000 turkeys worth $60,000, $40,000 in canned goods and fresh produce, and another $22,000 in direct cash payments to families facing particular hardship. Total cost, $100,000. Total number of people fed, approximately 10,000. Total number of arrest warrants executed against Johnson for this massive criminal operation funding community charity. 0, because even the police standing across the street watching the entire spectacle understood that arresting a man for feeding the poor would trigger riots that would burn Harlem to the ground. This was Johnson's 23rd year conducting the Thanksgiving distribution. He started in 1940 with 200 turkeys, purchased with his first substantial policy gambling profits, back when he was just another young hustler trying to make his mark in Harlem's underworld. The operation had grown methodically over the years. Johnson's financial manager, Raymond "Junie" Bird, began planning each October, coordinating with Harlem ministers to identify struggling families, purchasing turkeys wholesale from Bronx suppliers for $20 each, ordering pies from local bakeries to support legitimate Harlem businesses, arranging refrigerated trucks, and setting up distribution tents with the same precision Bird usually applied to calculating policy payouts. Now, 2 decades after that first modest giveaway, Johnson had become the undisputed king of Harlem, the man who survived Dutch Schultz's attempt to take over in the 1930s, who spent a decade in Alcatraz and came back stronger, who sits at the same table with Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello negotiating how to divide New York's criminal territories, and who every Thanksgiving transforms himself from gangster into something Harlem has far less of than criminals. A man who actually gives a damn whether poor people eat. The scene on Thursday was extraordinary not just for its scale, but for its brazenness. Johnson wasn't hiding. He wasn't operating through intermediaries. He was standing in the open on Harlem's busiest street in broad daylight, with news photographers taking pictures and reporters conducting interviews, personally handing out food purchased with money that everyone knew came from illegal gambling, surrounded by bodyguards who were themselves wanted by police, operating a distribution system more efficient than any government welfare program and more generous than any church charity, demonstrating once again the fundamental paradox that has made Bumpy Johnson simultaneously Harlem's most wanted criminal and its most untouchable citizen. The money he takes from the community through gambling comes back to the community through charity. The man who profits from vice also prevents starvation, and the gangster the police have spent 30 years trying to imprison is protected not by guns or corruption, but by the simple fact that 10,000 Harlem residents ate Thanksgiving dinner on Thursday because he decided they should. Margaret Washington, a 77-year-old widow who lives on $42 a month Social Security, waited in line for 3 hours to receive her turkey. When she finally reached the distribution table where Johnson stood, she grabbed his hand with both of hers and held on tight. "Mr. Johnson, God bless you. I live on $10 a week after I pay my rent. Without this turkey, without this food you're giving me, I don't eat this week. The welfare office says I make too much to qualify for assistance because I've got that $42 coming in. But you don't ask how much I make. You just give. You're a better man than all those politicians and social workers who are supposed to help people like me." Johnson handed her the turkey, added extra cans of vegetables that weren't part of the standard distribution, pulled an envelope from his coat pocket containing $50 in cash, and said quietly, "Mrs. Washington, you take this. You pay your rent, you keep your lights on, you buy yourself something nice. Don't tell anybody I gave it to you, and don't thank me. You're a Harlem woman. You deserve to eat on Thanksgiving. That's all there is to it." Mrs. Washington started crying, tried to return the money, insisted it was too much, but Johnson closed her fingers around the envelope and called to one of his men to help her carry her food home. Robert Jackson stood 20 people behind Mrs. Washington in line, a 34-year-old steel worker who'd been laid off in August and hadn't found work since, despite looking every single day. His unemployment benefits ran out in October. His wife cleans houses for $8 a week. They're 3 months behind on rent and facing eviction. Their 4 children have been eating beans and rice for dinner every night for 2 months because that's all the family can afford. Jackson watched Johnson hand Mrs. Washington that envelope of cash and wondered if maybe, just maybe, Johnson might help his family too, might see that they were desperate, might give them something beyond the turkey that was already more than Jackson thought he deserved, since he'd never gambled in Johnson's policy banks and had no connection to Johnson's organization beyond living in the neighborhood Johnson controlled. When Jackson reached the front of the line, Johnson looked at him for a long moment, really looked, the way you look at someone when you're trying to understand their situation without making them explain it. "You work the steel yards?" Johnson asked. Jackson nodded. "Got laid off 3 months ago. Been looking for work ever since. Nothing out there." Johnson handed him the turkey, then started adding extra food to Jackson's pile without asking. Extra cans, extra produce, 2 pies instead of 1. "You got kids?" Johnson asked. 4, Jackson said. "Oldest is 9, youngest is 2. Johnson called over Raymond Bird, who stood nearby with his ever-present ledger. "Junie, what have we got left for special cases?" Bird consulted the numbers. "About 4,000 in the emergency fund, Bump." Johnson nodded. "Give Mr. Jackson 200. Write down his name and address. I want someone checking on him in 2 weeks to see if he found work. If he hasn't, we'll help again." He turned back to Jackson. "You take that money, you pay your rent, you feed your family. You don't owe me nothing. You're a working man who hit bad luck. That's not your fault. You'll find work soon, and when you do, you remember that Bumpy Johnson helped you when nobody else would. That's all I ask." Jackson took the envelope with shaking hands, tried to thank Johnson, couldn't find words, just stood there holding $200 that would keep his family from being thrown into the street, holding food that would give his children their first real meal in months, and crying like he hadn't cried since his father died. One of Johnson's men gently took Jackson's arm and guided him away from the distribution table, helped him carry his food, made sure he got home safely with everything Johnson had given him. This happened perhaps 50 times on Thursday, Johnson identifying families in particular distress and providing extra assistance that went beyond the standard distribution, pulling money from his own pocket or directing Bird to make additional payments, treating his criminal fortune as a resource that existed not just to make him wealthy, but to prevent the absolute worst hardships that poverty inflicts on families who've committed no crime except being born black in America, where that alone guarantees economic struggle that never ends. Further back in the line, 23-year-old Gloria Mendez waited with her infant daughter wrapped in 3 blankets against the cold. Her husband was in Rikers Island on a weapons charge, leaving Gloria alone with a 6-month-old baby and no income except what she made taking in washing. "I never asked for charity in my life," she told the woman standing next to her in line. "My mother raised me to work for what we have, but Miguel won't be home until January. The baby needs formula I can't afford, and I heard Mr. Johnson was giving out cash to mothers with children. I don't care if he's a criminal. Right now, he's the only person offering to help." When Gloria reached Johnson, he took one look at the baby, called Bird over, and without even asking Gloria about her circumstances, handed her a turkey, double the standard food package, and an envelope containing $100. "You got a baby there," Johnson said simply. "Babies need formula, diapers, medicine. This should help. You need more. You come see me personally. Don't go through my people. You come straight to me. Understand?" Gloria nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, and walked away carrying more food and money than she'd seen in months. Across the street, NYPD Captain Michael O'Sullivan of the 32nd Precinct stood with 3 other officers watching the distribution and feeling the particular frustration that comes from knowing you're witnessing criminal activity but being powerless to do anything about it. O'Sullivan has spent 15 years trying to arrest Bumpy Johnson on charges that will stick. He's personally arrested Johnson 8 times. Every case has been dismissed. Witnesses refuse to testify, evidence disappears, judges find technical problems that require charges to be dropped. And now O'Sullivan stands here watching Johnson operate completely in the open, distributing food purchased with money. O'Sullivan knows comes from illegal gambling, surrounded by known criminals who serve as Johnson's enforcers and who've committed murders that O'Sullivan can't prove. And there's nothing O'Sullivan can do except watch and seethe and understand that if he tried to arrest Johnson right now, in front of 10,000 Harlem residents who've just received food from Johnson's generosity, the neighborhood would explode into violence that would make the recent Birmingham riots look tame by comparison. A reporter from the Herald approached O'Sullivan around noon, asked him why police weren't intervening, why they were letting a known criminal operate so brazenly. O'Sullivan's response was pure, frustrated honesty. "What do you want me to do? Arrest him for giving away turkeys? Shut down a food distribution that's feeding thousands of people who'd otherwise go hungry? We'd look like monsters. Every newspaper in the city would crucify us. The mayor would have my badge. And for what? To prove some point about the rule of law? Johnson is smarter than that. He's created a situation where arresting him would be worse than letting him operate. He's turned charity into armor that makes him untouchable. It makes me sick, but there's nothing I can do about it today." The reporter pressed, "But isn't there something deeply wrong with a system where criminals provide better social services than the government?" O'Sullivan's face hardened. "You want to know what's deeply wrong? I'll tell you what's deeply wrong. The city spends $200 million a year on welfare programs. We've got agencies and departments and social workers and administrators, and not one of them organized anything remotely comparable to what Johnson is doing today. He's feeding more people in one day than the city feeds in a month. He's doing it more efficiently, more generously, with more dignity for the recipients than any government program provides. So yeah, something's deeply wrong, but what's wrong isn't Johnson. He's just a criminal, doing what criminals do, taking money from people and giving some of it back. What's wrong is that our entire legitimate system has failed so completely that a gangster's charity is the only thing standing between thousands of families and starvation. You want to write about something deeply wrong? Write about that." By mid-afternoon, word had spread throughout Harlem that Johnson's distribution was particularly generous this year, that he was giving out cash payments in addition to food, that he was helping families with specific problems beyond just providing Thanksgiving dinner. The line, which had shrunk to perhaps 200 people by 1 p.m., suddenly swelled again as families who hadn't planned to come decided to take a chance, to see if maybe Johnson would help them with the rent they couldn't pay, or the medical bills they couldn't afford, or the utilities that were about to be shut off. Johnson didn't turn anyone away. When he ran out of turkeys around 6 p.m., he sent his men to buy more from local butchers, paying full retail price plus generous tips, keeping the distribution operating even as darkness fell and temperatures dropped below freezing. 71-year-old Henry Brooks arrived at 6:45 p.m. after the official distribution was supposed to have ended, hobbling on a cane because arthritis made walking difficult. He'd been a Pullman porter for 40 years before the railroad laid him off in 1960, and now he lived on a pension that barely covered his rent in a single room above a laundromat on 132nd Street. "I heard on the radio that Mr. Johnson was giving away food," Brooks told one of Johnson's men at the distribution table. "I know I'm late, and if there's nothing left, that's all right. I just thought I'd try." Johnson overheard this, walked over, and personally handed Brooks a turkey that his men had just purchased from a nearby butcher. "Mr. Brooks, you worked 40 years keeping white people comfortable on their railroad journeys. You deserve better than a pension that doesn't cover your rent. You take this turkey, and you take this." He handed Brooks an envelope containing $75. "And you buy yourself a warm coat for the winter. Don't argue with me. Just take it and stay warm." Brooks tried to protest, but Johnson was already greeting the next person in line, already moving on to the next family that needed help, treating generosity as something so routine it didn't require acknowledgement or gratitude. Reverend Dr. William James of Mount Olivet Baptist Church showed up around 7 p.m., not to receive food, but to observe what Johnson was doing and to struggle with the moral contradictions that Johnson's annual charity created. Reverend James preaches against gambling every Sunday, tells his congregation that policy destroys families and corrupts communities, warns that men like Johnson are obstacles to black advancement rather than contributors to it. But every Thanksgiving, Reverend James watches Johnson feed more people than James's church can feed, help more families than the church's charity fund can help, demonstrate more practical concern for Harlem's poor than most of the ministers who preach righteousness without ever getting their hands dirty, actually helping people survive poverty's grinding daily reality. Johnson saw Reverend James standing at the edge of the distribution area and walked over, still carrying a half-smoked cigar, his expensive coat now dusted with flour from the bags of food he'd been handling all day. "Reverend James, you come to condemn me for running policy, or you come to see if maybe I'm doing something that matters?" Johnson's tone wasn't hostile, just tired, the voice of a man who'd been standing in the cold for 13 hours and who was genuinely curious whether this minister would acknowledge that sometimes criminals do more good than preachers. Reverend James chose his words carefully. "Brother Johnson, I can't endorse where your money comes from. Policy gambling destroys families. I've counseled too many men who gambled away their paychecks, too many women whose husbands chose the numbers over feeding their children. So I can't stand here and say what you do is right." He paused, looking at the families still receiving food, at the children clutching turkeys, almost as big as they were, at elderly people who clearly hadn't eaten well in weeks. "But I also can't deny that today you're doing God's work, even if the money comes from the devil's business. You're feeding people who would go hungry otherwise. You're keeping families together who'd be evicted without your help. And you're doing it with more grace and more dignity than the government provides. So I'll say this. I hope one day you stop running policy and use your considerable talents for purely legitimate purposes. But until that day comes, I thank you for this, for feeding our people, for remembering that with wealth comes obligation." Johnson nodded slowly, took a drag from his cigar. "Reverend, I appreciate that you came. I know what I am. I know I'm a criminal. I don't pretend otherwise. But I also know that I was born poor in South Carolina, that my family went hungry more times than I can count, that there were Thanksgivings when we had nothing to eat because my father couldn't find work and nobody gave a damn whether we starved. That stays with you. That makes you understand that poverty isn't some abstract problem you can solve with prayers and good intentions. Poverty is real. It's children crying because their stomachs hurt from hunger. It's old people choosing between medicine and food. It's working men feeling like failures because they can't provide for their families. I make my money from gambling, yeah, but I also make sure that nobody in Harlem goes hungry on Thanksgiving if I can prevent it. Maybe that doesn't balance the scales. Maybe I'm still going to hell despite all this. But at least when I get there, I can tell God I tried to do one thing right." The last family received their food at 8:17 p.m. Johnson personally handed them their turkey, shook the father's hand, wished them a happy Thanksgiving, and watched them walk away, carrying food that would feed them for a week. Then he stood there for a moment, looking at the empty tables that 14 hours earlier had been covered with 3,000 turkeys and $40,000 worth of other food, looking at the empty street where thousands of people had waited in the cold. And for just a moment, his face showed something that looked like satisfaction, like he'd accomplished something important, like maybe all the crimes and all the violence and all the moral compromises had been worth it, because today 10,000 people ate who might not have eaten otherwise. Raymond Byrd approached with his ledger. "That's everyone, Bump. 3,000 turkeys distributed, all the canned goods gone, all the produce gone, all 2,000 pies given out. We handed out cash payments to 412 families, total of $22,300. Grand total for the day, $100,375.16. Byrd said this with the same precision he used when reporting policy gambling profits, treating charitable giving as just another business expense that needed to be accurately recorded. Johnson smiled slightly. $100,000 to feed Harlem. You know how much I made from policy last month, Junie. $400,000. So I gave back 25% of 1 month's profits to make sure families ate on Thanksgiving. That seems about right. That seems fair. He looked at Bird. Make sure we do this again next year, and make it bigger. I want 4,000 turkeys next year. I want to feed 15,000 people. I want every family in Harlem that needs help to know they can count on Bumpy Johnson on Thanksgiving, that as long as I'm alive and making money, nobody goes hungry on this holiday. You understand? Bird nodded. I understand, Bump. 4,000 turkeys next year, 15,000 people. I'll start planning in October. He paused. You know, Bump, people are going to remember this. Not the policy, not the numbers, not the other stuff. They're going to remember that you fed them when nobody else would. That's a legacy worth having. Johnson crushed his cigar under his shoe, pulled his coat tighter against the cold that was getting worse now that night had fallen. Legacy. That's a fancy word for what you leave behind when you die. I don't know about legacy, Junie. I just know that I'm 58 years old. I've been running Harlem for 30 years. I've made millions of dollars from people's hope that their number will hit, and the least I can do is give some of it back. Not because I'm a good man, I'm not. Not because I'm trying to buy forgiveness, I'm not. But because it's right. Because these are my people. Because Harlem made me who I am, and I owe Harlem something for that. So every Thanksgiving, I pay what I owe. Simple as that. He climbed into the back of the black Cadillac that had been waiting for him all day. His bodyguards got in behind him. The car pulled away from the curb, driving slowly through streets where people were carrying the food Johnson had given them, where children were asking their parents why that man gave them so much food, where families were having conversations they'd been dreading about how they'd afford Thanksgiving, but that now didn't need to happen because Bumpy Johnson had made sure they'd eat. Back at his office above the Palm Cafe on 125th Street, Johnson poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon, stood at the window looking out at Harlem's lights, and allowed himself a moment of something that might have been contentment. Tomorrow he'd go back to being Harlem's policy king, would collect bets and pay winners, and deal with runners who were stealing and with competitors who needed to be eliminated. Tomorrow he'd be the gangster the police wanted to arrest and the criminal that ministers denounced from pulpits. But today, for one day, he'd been something different. Today, he'd been the man who made sure 10,000 people ate Thanksgiving dinner. And in Harlem in 1963, where poverty was crushing and where legitimate institutions provided minimal help and where being black meant facing discrimination at every turn, that mattered more than all the sermons about morality and all the police investigations into his crimes and all the newspaper editorials condemning gangsters who corrupted communities. Because at the end of the day, the families who received food from Bumpy Johnson on Thursday didn't care that he was a criminal. They cared that they were going to eat. And that simple fact, that caring and feeding people mattered more than moral purity, was why Bumpy Johnson would die years later, not in prison and not in a hail of bullets from competitors or police, but in his bed in Harlem, surrounded by people who loved him, mourned by thousands who remembered that he fed them when nobody else would, protected by a community that understood that saints don't survive in Harlem, but that sometimes gangsters do God's work despite themselves.